Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf Lamed Zayin. We're going to start with the continuation of where we ended. We were defining the end of Rabbi Acha's statement, Rabbi Achai's statement, where he said, "Gazru davar acher mishum davar acher." What is the davar acher mishum davar acher? So they explained that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, "Gazru tinok ovei kochavim shitma beziva vehobi tamei ziva," even if he doesn't have any discharge, and that was to create. There was a concern for homosexual relations between the Gentiles and the Jews, and that would create this separation. So now the Gemara had said, okay, we quoted all these rabbis, Damar, Rabbi Zera, Tzar Gadol, Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Yochanan, this one, that one, that one, that one. And then they said, Me'ematai, Mitame B'zivan, he said to him, Ben Yomo, right, 1 day old. And then when he got to Rabbi Chia, he said, Ben Tesha Shani B'yom Echad. Okay, it was 9 and a day. And then he said, "Ukshebati v'rtzeiti devarai lifnei Rebbe, amar li hanach devarai ve'echos devarai Rabbi Chia, ta'amar tinok ovei kochavim, ematayim mitamei b'ziva ben teshani v'yom echad." Okay, so Rebbe said, forget what I said, go with Rabbi Chia, who said it's 9 and a day. Ho'il v'ro'il lebi'at mitamei nami b'ziva. And he made this connection, since the whole issue was the issue of homosexual relations, it's only from when they're ro'il lebi'at, where they can potentially have intercourse, where their intercourse would be considered intercourse. So Amar Ravina. Ravina now derives from here, top of our daf. Hilka chati noket ovedet kochavim bat gimel shani v'yom echad ho'ilu huyal biyam mitamanami b'ziva. So now they say, okay, well, what about the girls? So say it must be the girls from the age of 3 and a day, because that is the day the girls potentially could be considered, if someone was to have intercourse with them, that would be considered intercourse. Now, this always strikes us as a little bit difficult. What do you mean? Girls at that age are not exactly engaging in intercourse. So in fact, this is an interesting sugya because it is going to create some sort of distinction here. So the Gemara says pshita. Ravina said is quite obvious. The age for boys is 9 and a day. The age for girls is 3 and a day. That's what comes across the board. Whenever we discuss, is someone ra'oi lebi'at, can they potentially have intercourse or not? So the Gemara says, well, let's think about the situation here. What's the concern? The concern is that when you start engaging in connections with these people, it could lead to sexual relations. So the idea is if you start hanging out, being together with girls at that age, it could lead to sexual relations. So the Gemara says, that's crazy, right? Right? An older girl could maybe try to seduce or, get involved in having sexual relations with these boys, but this 3-year-old in a day is definitely not doing that, right? No matter what. And this is clear. It's not that the rabbis thought this is what was going on. No, what they were trying to say when they gave this age, okay, I'm kind of stopping mid-sentence in terms of the Gemara, but they're differentiating and they're saying a 3-year-old girl, and you might have thought because a 3-year-old girl is not exactly seducing anybody, then maybe because of that, they wouldn't determine that this is the age. And therefore, Kamash Malan, that's why it's teaching you, no, that is the age. And that's because of what we call lo plug. When we make a determination that 3 is the age, and now let's discuss, so why is 3 the age? 3 is the age because that's when the rabbis understood that if a man were to engage in sexual relations with a girl at that age, which should never happen, okay, but if God forbid they would, that would already be, there was enough development on the part of the child that I think there was this idea that also that would tear their virginity, their hymen, whereas if it's under 3, it would actually kind of like if it was torn, then it would kind of come back. And wouldn't be torn, would be later torn again. So they determined that was the age. Once they determine the age, there's all sorts of ramifications, even if they're not really relevant. That is a helpful thing because, again, this always strikes us as very odd, but it seems to be like a more physiological determination, but not really determined based on, what a girl is at that age. Mistamech v'aza Rabbi Yehuda Nesia akatve de Rabbi Simlai, Shem'eh. So Rabbi Simlai was the Shem'eh, the Shamash, of Rabbi Yehuda Nissi. A lot of times, by the way, ayin and shin also switch in Aramaic. Ayin is instead of shin, shama is shamash. So Rabbi Yehuda Nissi, who is the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nissi, was resting on the shoulders of Rabbi Simlai. It basically means, right, he was helping him walk. He was older. Amar Rabbi Simlai. So they engage in conversation. Lo ayita emesh bebeit midrash kashitarnu et hashemen. Weren't you yesterday in the Beit Midrash? When, right? Amar le simlai lo ayita emesh bebeit midrash kashitarnu et hashemen. So Rabbi Yehuda Nissi says, were you not in the Beit Midrash yesterday when we permitted the shemen, the oil of the Gentiles? This is back to the cases in the Mishnah. Amar lo b'yameinu tatir af et hapat. So Rabbi Simlai says to him, why don't you also permit the pot, their bread? Okay, now it's an interesting footnote in the Quran, which basically says, right, if you go back earlier, you see that people weren't really keeping this pot gzera. So this is like a good example of if people aren't keeping it, maybe you should just matir it and just allow it anyway. So Amar lo im ken karolam beitin sharia. And here's a fascinating one. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya says, listen, I don't really want to be caught as being called I don't want our court to be called a matir beitin. Like we're the ones who matir. We permit everything. We don't want to be pegged as that because people won't have respect for our decisions anymore. So while I agree with you, it sounds like he's saying, I can't do it because of the effects that it will have. And this just, we all are familiar with the effects of being too liberal and how people peg you as too liberal, and that could create problems. So you have to, what he's saying is, I have to walk a fine line. I'll permit the oil, not the bread. Okay. And you can see because the oil is a little less, there's less contact with people when it comes to the oil as opposed to the bread, which is a bit more of something you're eating and you're eating together maybe. So anyway, he says, no, I'm not going to do that. Ditnan. Okay, now why is he worried they're going to call his court a Beit Din Sharia? Because it happened once in history. Way back when, if we go back before the Tannaitic period, there were the Zugot, right? Hillel and Shammai are the last of the Zugot, and Yossi ben Yoezer is one of the first, is the first. So he eid Rabbi Yossi Ditnan, okay, it's a Mishnah Eduyot. He eid Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer ish tzreida al ayal kamsa, or kimsa, dachan, ve'al mashke beit mitbachai dachan, ve'al dikrav lemita misai. Okay, this sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo. Okay, ayal kimsa is a type of locust that it was dachan. Dachan is tahor. It comes from zach, dalet and zayin. Switch. In Aramaic, zachan, like Shem and Zayed, zach, pure. Okay, so that it's pure meaning it's kosher. He said this animal's kosher. He said that the liquids in the Beit Mitbachai, in the place in the slaughterhouse area in the temple, pure. Okay, the liquids are pure. We'll talk about all this later. And the ones who get close to a dead body are tamei. Okay, that sounds weird. That sounds like a chumrah, not a kula. But let's just assume it's a kula right now, even though we don't understand. Yosef Sharia, and they called him Yosef, the one who permits things. And I don't want to have our court to be called that. Amarle, hatam shar tzlat, umar shar chada. But I'm just asking you, right? You only permitted one thing. He permitted three things. If you permit this one more, you'll only be two, right? We always have this idea of three is a chazaka. As long as it's not three, I don't think they're going to call you a Beit Din Sharia. Right? The ish shari mar chada achrita akarte tartin hu dahavyan. Right? So he says, and if you do one more, it still will only be two, and it's not a big deal. Amarle anasharia achrite. He says, well, I also permitted something else. Now, he doesn't say what it was, but he said, I already have two under my belt, and therefore we can't permit a third. So now the Gemara wants to know, obviously, Mahi, what is this third one? Titnan zegitech im lo ba'ati mikam ba'ad 12 chodesh. This will be your get. This brings us all the way back to Gitin, for those who learn Gitin. This will be your get on condition if I don't come back within 12 months. Now, the man would generally do this. He was going on a trip. He was worried maybe something will happen to him on the way, and he didn't want his wife to have to do yibum. Okay? So, or theoretically, he also didn't want her to end up in a guna. Like, what if they never find him? What if he's dead and there's no witnesses and nobody tells her? Right? In those days, especially. So he says, this will be your get if I don't come back in 12 months. Right? Now, the issue with the yibum is if they have no kids, then let's say he dies. Right? So if he dies, she'll be able to get married again, but only after she does yibum or chalitza. So sometimes it's also to have to prevent her from avoiding that. And we're going to see in this situation, that's really what we're going to get to, because in the end, he dies. Now, here's an interesting thing, because it was given on the t'nai that he doesn't show up in 12 months. But in the end, he dies first. So now the question is, when does the get go into effect? Does the get go into effect at the end of the 12 months, but he's already dead? There's no get after death, which means she wasn't divorced, which means he died, which means, now, of course, she could get married, but she can't get married until she does Yibum or Chalitza with his brother, assuming they have no children. So they say, ain't no get. Okay, that's not a get according to the Mishnah, exactly for the reason I just said, because the get only goes into effect later. Okay, the Mishnah talks about it. What if I said me'achshav? This is your get from now if I don't come back after 12 months. And if he dies in the middle, since he said from now, the get goes into effect now, the earlier date, and therefore she actually can get married without doing Yibum or Chalitza if he dies within the 12 months. So this case, he didn't say me'achshav from now, and therefore it only kicks in later. However, Tane Allah, there's a bright on that says, V'rabotenu hitiruha lina say. The rabbis permitted her to get married without Yibum and Chalitza. In other words, they disagree with this halacha in the Mishnah. V'amrina, my rabotenu, who are the rabbis, they say, and this is all to help us figure out what else did Rabbi Yehuda Nasi matir. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Beit Dino Desharu Mishcha. It's the ones who permitted the oil, they also permitted this one, which would be our case. That's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And what's the reason? How could they permit it? The person didn't say me'achshav. So, Sabri Laki Rabbi Yossi, Ta'amar Zmano Shashtar Mochiach Alav. Because he holds like these rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his court, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he held like the position of Rabbi Yossi, who said that the date of the shtar proves it. Meaning, even though you didn't say me'achshav, since you put the date that you wrote it, which was a year in advance of when the condition was going to be up, it's an indicator that you meant for the get to go into effect now in the event that you don't show up in 12 months. It's as if you said me'achshav. V'amar Rabbi Abba, Berei de Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Okay, now this was all to explain what was that case that Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya permitted. However, Rabbi Abba has a different version, and that's all based on Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, who says these were the rabbis who permitted it, right? And it was this baiting. But Rabbi Abba, Berei de Rabbi Chia bar Abba, said that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, which really seems to mean, according to the commentaries, Nasiya, not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Okay, as again, they were both Nasi'im, but they changed the name of the grandson so that people wouldn't confuse who's who. So, but here it seems like they called him by the original name of the Nasi, but really it's Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya. Hore taught this, V'lo hodulo, but the court didn't agree with him. Kol sha'ato, okay, they didn't agree with him for the rest of his life. Or amrula kol siato. Some people say his whole court didn't agree with him, not necessarily all his life, but his court. Okay, which sounds like it's not the court that permitted this. It's not his court. His court actually didn't agree with him at all. And then, according to this opinion, this wouldn't be the case. You'd have to find another case. And in fact, there's room to say there's some other case that he matured. Anyway, putting that issue aside, the Gemara doesn't get involved in that. But he wouldn't put this as the third case or the second case, really, so as to avoid the third case of the bread. Amar le Rabbi Elazar lahu Saba. Now, there was a Rabbi Elazar asked this elderly person who was living at the time that Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya did this, and he said, Kishritua, must have been he was in the court. He's like, listen, when they matir this, or he was at least in the court in the room, or maybe he was one of the court people, not clear, but he says to this elderly man, Kishritu la alter shritua de lo ate. Well, now we have a really good question. The man said, this will be a get in the event that I don't come back in 12 months. And then, let's say, in month 6, he dies. So now, when does the get go into effect? According to Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, it goes into effect because it's as if the get goes into effect from the original day. But when do we determine that the get went into effect from before the death? Do we determine it at the moment of death, 6 months into it? Or do we have to wait until the 12 months are up? Because we need to wait and see that the person didn't come after 12 months. Now, of course, they're not going to come, they're dead. On the other hand, maybe the 12 months have to pass before we can actually permit it. So that's his question. Let's read it again. Ki shiritua, because I didn't read the whole question inside. When they permitted her, la alter shiritua, from the moment he died, they said, okay, well, now your get's in effect from 6 months ago. De lo ate, because it's clear he's not coming. Oh, Dilma, or perhaps maybe you have to wait the 12 months to have the condition be fulfilled that he doesn't actually show up at the end of the 12-month period. And now the Gemara, the Hausaba asks him, Ditnan, right? Why didn't you ask this question on the Mishnah? Which case of the Mishnah? Not the one we saw, but the one I mentioned. Ditnan, this will be your get from now if I don't come from now until 12 months from now. Now here he said me'achshav, from now, in the event that I don't come back in 12 months. Have a get. Right? So it's going to be a get because the condition was fulfilled. He didn't come back, and the get went into effect from the moment of the writing of the get. The man was still alive, so there is a get. Right? If it only goes into effect at 12 months, then there's no get. But the question is, Tibayalach, you should have asked the question there. La alter havigita, right? Why ask the question on this takana if you could ask it on the original halacha in the Mishnah of the case where it actually does work? Remember, Rabbi Nasiya disagreed with the other case where it didn't work because you didn't say me'achshav. But in this case, you should have asked the same question there. Better to ask it on the Mishnah than on this takana, right? And you should have asked la'alter havegita. So when he says me'achshav and he dies, let's say 6 months into the year, do we say the get is immediate to haloata because it's clear he's not going to come? Or do you have to wait until the 12 months passes so that the condition could be completely fulfilled? The 12 months have passed, the husband doesn't show up. And then again, either which way, it'll be retroactive to the original date. But the question is, does the woman have to wait those 6 months or not to, if she wants to remarry? Inachinami. So the guy, he says, well, I could have asked it. You're right. I totally could have asked it on that. But Ela Mishum Dahavia Bahi Minyana. But I asked you about what happened because you were in the court. Here you see he was actually part of the minyan. You were part of the rabbis in the court who determined this. So I thought you would know. Okay? But you're right. I could have asked it on the court. Now comes Abaye and he says, we have this machloka between Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya and his takana versus the Mishnah. The question is, in what case, what wording of a shtar would they agree, and in what wording of a shtar would they disagree? So hakol modim, we're going to bring 3 cases and say in case number 1 and case number 2, they all agree. Either that for sure it works or for sure it doesn't work. And in this middle case, we're going to have a debate. Hakol modim, if you say, this will be your get, when the sun rises, okay, when it comes out of its place. So when the sun rises, if you say, this will be your get when the sun rises, okay, and then he dies before the sun rises. So for sure, everyone agrees here. We were saying, this will be your get when the sun rises. Clearly, it's not your get until the sun rises. If the husband dies first, it's not a get. He was obviously saying when it comes out. And if he dies at night, then get lachamitu. That's a classic case of the get only kicks in after death, and there's no such thing as a get kicking in after death. If you say, al minat shetetzei chamar min artika, I will give you, this will be your get, I'm giving it to you now, but this will be your get on the condition that the sun rises in the morning. So in that case, me'achshav kamarle, it's as if he says from now, right? Just assuming that later on some event happens, like the sun rising. So if he dies at night, right? In the end, the condition is fulfilled after his death, but it's retroactive to now because he was saying, this is your get. As long as something later happens, your get will be your get from now. And then that's a get while he's still alive. So this statement that Abaye said is just like Rav Huna says, because Rav Huna said, if you say al manat under the condition that this happened, then it's as if you said me'achshav, from now. Lo nechleku ela, so what's the machloket? Be'im tetzei, if you say if it comes out. So if you say if, that's not clear. This will be your get if, right? If I don't come back in 12 months. If is unclear. Does it mean it's starting now? Or does it mean, right, when it happens, it's as if I said, right, what I meant was if and when it happens then. Okay? So then it will be your get only then. So it's unclear, and that's why there's a machlok. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Sarah la Rabbi, which again is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Sarah la Rabbi Yossi, Tamar zmano shel shtar muchia chalav, v'havile kemehayom imati keme'achshav imati. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi holds like Rabbi Yossi on this issue and says it's the date on the shtar that proves it, that you really meant from now. Okay, it's like saying from now, it's not like saying from today. The Rabbana, lately to Rabbi Yossi, they don't agree with Rabbi Yossi. This is like saying, this is your get if I die. Greda, right? Like classic. This is your get if I die. If the sun comes out in the morning, that's happening later. Okay? Goof. Now we're going to go back into this statement that I clearly kind of didn't pay too much attention to, but I said we'll get to it later, which is Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer ish Shreda, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya didn't want to be the Beit Din Matir, he used Rabbi Yossi as his example. Look, he's the one who was called the Beit Din Matir because he matired these 3 things. What were these 3 things? And what was his reason for permitting them? He Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer ish Shreda alayal kim tzadachan al mishkeh b'it b'chaya dachan v'al dikrav lemita misai. Okay, v'karole Rabbi Yosef, v'karole Yosef Sharia. They even called him disrespectfully. They didn't even call him Rabbi Yosef. They said Yosef, the Matir one. My ayal kamsa, so or kimsa. What is this case? Rapapa amar shushiva. It doesn't help us. It's a type of locust. Okay, Okay, two different types of locusts. We're going to see what was different about each of them. Rav Papa Amar Shushiva, v'kamiflagei b'rosho aroch. Well, the issue is like this, and Rashi explains this nicely. Kamiflagei in the bottom of 4 lines from the bottom. Yosef ben Yoezer and the rabbis b'rosho aruch desimanei chagavim torim nafkala me'arbeh salam chargol v'chagat. There's 4 types of creatures that they learn out the details about the locust from, okay, which is different types of locusts or from the locust family. And the issue is, okay, they say in the Gemara in Chulin, they talk about there's a klal upratu klal here, and basically we want to figure out what makes these similar, and therefore what else is similar to these. And they're similar in a bunch of ways. They mentioned at the very last line in Rashi here, 4 legs, 4 wings. They have karsulim, okay, I guess that's like ankles or something, and their wings cover the majority of their body. Okay, the wings are long wings that span the length of most of the length of their body. There's also, though, a 5th thing, and that really was the debate. Is the 5th thing also essential, which is that the head is round? And this creature, Shushiva, the head is long. And that's the machloket. Mar savar rosho arochasul. That's not, according to the rabbis, that's not one of the criteria of the kosher locust. And therefore, since that doesn't, right, this doesn't fit in, one of the criteria is the round head, doesn't fit in, it's not there. Umar Savar, Rosho Aroch Mutar. The other one says, no, as long as it's similar in the other 4 ways, the long head is fine. It's not one of the criteria that it needs in order to be kosher. That's why Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer permitted. Rav Chia bar Ami Mishmei De'ula Amar. Okay, now let's explain the suspiel one. What's unique about a suspiel? Suspiel. Okay, now turning now to Amabet. Birosho aruch aroch kule amalo pligi dasur. Everybody agrees that if you say suspiel, for sure the rosho aruch is on the outs. Okay, that's not kosher. Vahacha, what's the issue here? Well, it has wings that cover the majority of its body, but the problem is like this. Hacha b'knafav chofinet rubo al yedei hadchak kamiflagei. It just about gets to half. It just covers the half of the body. Now, Mar Savar Ruba Koldu B'Iman. So, Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer Umatchir said, as long as it's the majority, it's the majority. Mar Savar, but the rabbis who were strict said, no, Ruba de Minkar B'Iman. You need needs to noticeably cover the whole thing. It needs to be something people can tell. Because it's right in the middle there, people can't really tell. So while it actually, it's very fascinating to think about this, while it actually covers the majority and has the actual criteria, they weren't going to permit it because it didn't look like it necessarily had the criteria, and people wouldn't necessarily notice it, and that might cause them to think that other locusts with wings that are maybe looking similar but just under the half point would be permitted. And that would be a problem, so they wouldn't allow it. That's number 1. So again, he matir this type of locust, either that had a long head or that had these wings that were long, but not really just past the border of long enough, but not noticeable difference or not noticeably long enough. So my dachan, what does it mean pure? Or right, so what about these liquids? Rav Amar dachan mamash, completely pure, meaning it doesn't contract impurity at all. Ushmuel Amar dachan militamei acherim, aval tumat atzman yesh behem. It could become impure itself, the liquids in that room, but they can't pass on impurity, right? It's one thing to become impure. It's another to be able to not only become impure, but be able to pass on impurity. So to say they're just impure, it means, but they can't pass on impurity. So Rav says they actually are impure. I'm sorry, they're pure. They don't contract impurity at all. And Shmuel says, no, they contract impurity. They just don't pass it on. So again, look at about what he did. Okay, what he permitted, just like in the first case. Which one he permitted, we don't know. Also here, what he permitted. Rav Amar, now what's the basis of this machloket? Rav Amar dachan mamash, kasaval tumat mashkin de Rabbanan. Well, the whole reason is the fact that a mashke becomes, according to Rav, the fact that a liquid becomes impure, according to the Torah, it's foods that become impure, although we're going to see maybe also liquids. But Rav is going to say, according to the Torah, it's just foods that become impure. The fact that liquids can become impure is rabbinic in nature, completely. When the rabbis said we're going to make a Zarah and also make liquids impure, they said it on regular liquids, but they didn't want a lot of impurity in the temple. So they said, well, we're not going to have our Zarah de Rabbanan apply in the temple. It's also like Hilchot Shabbat, for example. All the rabbinic decrees don't apply in the temple when it comes to Shabbat. Because, right, there's necessary things to do, so they didn't apply it there. This is a little different. This is just because we want to avoid impurity in the temple if we can. Ushmuel amar, dachami l'tamei acherim. Of course it's gonna, right? It's gonna be pure from passing on impurity. Aval tumat atzman yesh behem, but of course it has tumat mashkin. Kasaval, because he holds tumat mashkin deoraita l'tamei acherim de Rabbanan. The fact that liquids become impure, that's a Torah law. And in a minute we'll see what this machloket is about. But like where they get it, it should be clear. Either it's in the Torah or it's not in the Torah. He thinks the fact that they become impure is already a Torah law. You can't then override that in the temple. But l'tamei achirim is d'Rabbanan. But the fact that they can have enough impurity to pass it on to something else, that's actually rabbinic. And then that they didn't make the decree for in the temple. So if you look at Rashi, Tumat Mashkin to Rabbanan, it quotes the Gemara Masechet Pesachim, Parchina. They question, how can you say it's to Rabbanan? Going back to Rav. Okay, I'm going to read you the pasuk. It's Yud Aleph, Perak Yud Aleph in Vayikra, pasuk Lamed Daled. It says, Mikola ochel asher yachel asher yavo alav mayim yitma. Any food that water gets upon it will become impure. V'chol mashkeh asher yishateh b'chol kli yitma. And any drink that you drink in a vessel, yitma, could become impure. That pretty much sounds like liquids become impure. However, if you notice in that pasuk, it already mentioned water gets on the food to create a susceptibility to impurity. And perhaps the liquid mentioned with the second and the latter part of the pasuk, according to Rav, is actually relating to liquids that can create a susceptibility to impurity, but not that they actually themselves are impure. And that's how to understand this machloket about why one would say it is by Torah law and one would say it isn't by Torah law. So that explained the machloket about the second Zarah of Rabbi Yossi, the second heter that he made. Okay, so then the third thing was he said the people come in contact with the dead will be impure, and then they called him Yosef Sharia. So Yosef Asra Mabayale, this last one should have had them say he's a strict one. Look, he said people who become in contact with the dead are impure. The Ode, well, okay, number one, that seems like a stringence. It's strict. But on the other hand, forget about that. What do you mean? That's a Torah law. That's not a rabbinic ordinance of saying, oh, if you touch their body, you're impure. That says so in the Torah. Anyone who touches in the field a dead body, right? Then what does it say? You're going to become impure. You're tamei for 7 days. Okay, so let's try to figure this out. Deoraita, we're going to have a number of attempts here. Deoraita dikrav tamei. Dikrav b'dikrav tahor. B'doraita, if you get close to a dead body and you come in contact with it, touch it, oh, well, all those things will become impure. But if you come close to someone and come in contact with them, touch a person who's dikrav b'dikrav, meaning you get close to someone who got close to a dead body, you're not impure, okay? You're tahor. Va'atu inu. Now, again, we need to find out, number one, what was done here that wasn't by Torah law. So now we're going to say, someone coming in contact with someone who is impure to the dead. That's not by Torah law. Although if you think it is, don't worry, it is. We're going to correct this later. Okay, so originally that was pure. Okay, originally if you touch a person who touched a dead body, you're actually pure. Came the rabbis and said, we're going to make you impure if you came in contact with a person who was a tamei maid, right? A person who came in contact with a dead who then touches another person, they'll become impure. And what did he do? He permitted that case. He said, you know what? I'm going to reestablish the Torah law. Only someone who comes in contact with the dead is tamei. So now they say, no, wait a minute. This doesn't work, as I mentioned before. Of course, someone who comes in contact with someone who came in contact with a dead body is impure already from the Torah. And anything that the tamei touches will become impure, which includes people. So, Amura Rabbanan Kamei Rabba Mishmei Rav Zutra Berei Rav Nachman Amar Mishmei Rav Nachman. That was a bit of a long sentence to say the rabbi said in front of Rabba, in the name of Rav Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, who said it in his father's name. Okay, this is important. Remember, this is all said in the name of Rav Nachman. To Oraita, so a different explanation. To Oraita Dikrav B'Dikrav B'Chiburin Tumat Shiva Shelo B'Chiburin Tumat Erev. By Torah law, there's a distinction between if I'm, let's say, touching a dead body, and while I'm touching that dead body, I touch you. Okay, think about how it conducts. that tumah is going to go to you and you're going to be tameh 7 days. But if I touch the dead body and then I stop and I'm not touching the dead body anymore and then I touch you, then you're going to have impurity only of Tumat Erev. That's 1 day impurity. That's the Torah law. Came the rabbis, and what did they say? They said you're going to be tameh 7 days, even if I wasn't touching the dead body when I touched you. And what did he do? Rabbi Yossi, he reverted it back to the original Torah law. Now, where do you see this in the Torah? Well, dichtiv, and now they're going to question this whole theory. Well, like, where do you see this distinction in the Torah between chiburin and not chiburin? It says in the Torah, "Hanogeh b'met l'chol nefesh adam," right? If you touch a dead body, v'tamei shivat yamim, and then it says, "Uchtiv v'chol asher yiga bo hatamei yitma." Okay, and anyone who touches this person will become impure. Uchtiv v'nefesh hanogat titma ad erev, and then it says, and the person who touches will be impure to the evening. So haketzad. First, it sounds like itma, just like the person was tamei, they'll become tamei. That's 7 days, and then it says titma ad erev. So how could this be? Now we're going to see where the source is that this was the Torah law, distinguished between chiburin and not, even though it doesn't say so in the Torah. Kan b'chiburin, kan shelo b'chiburin. One pasuk seems to indicate tuma of a day, and one pasuk seems to indicate 7 days. We must assume there's a difference. Well, we'll assume it's because of the chiburin or not, and that explains this distinction. However, comes Rava with a statement that Rava says a number of times. Amar lehu Rava lava mina lechu lo tidle bebuki struki b'Rav Nachman. Didn't I tell you, don't put these empty jugs on Rav Nachman? In other words, don't start claiming things that Rav Nachman said when he really didn't say them. This is not something Rav Nachman said. I know it's not. Hachi amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said, and you got it all wrong. Okay, we tried a number of attempts to try to figure out what the Torah law was, what the rabbis forbade, and what the kickback was from Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer, who says, let's get rid of the takana of the rabbis. It didn't have to do with impurity of the dead. It was something else. Okay, it has to do with impurity of the dead, but in a very different way. So now he's going to say, this is what Rav Nachman said. What he came to matir was this. Safek tumah b'reshut harabim hitir lahem. He came to matir, this big basic halacha that we actually know to be the case, but remember, this is way back when, the beginning of the Zugot, way before the Tanaim even. He said this halacha and was deemed to be a very makil rabbi, but in the end, this actually becomes very accepted in halacha. So much so that the Gemara is going to say, isn't that obvious though? We all know this. Okay, so what did he say? If you have a doubt about whether you went, let's say you went in a field and you don't know if there's a dead body there or not. If it's in the public domain, you're going to be pure. You don't have to worry about safek tumah. If it's in a private domain, you actually are going to be tameh. But what he said is, don't worry about it if you're in a public domain. We're going to be completely makel here. Okay, you don't have to worry. It's as if you didn't go through the place. There's no concern. Maybe you're impure. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? He permitted this. This is the halacha we learn out of the Sota. Masota rishutei yachid av tuma rishutei yachid. The Sota, this is very famous, that we learned this whole halacha of safek tuma from a Sota. A Sota, it's not impurity, the same kind of impurity, but she is called tme'ah according to the Torah, right? If she slept with this man. Now, where's the whole doubt for her that we're going to be strict with her? If it was in private, if there was a concern that she engaged in a relationship with this man in public, nobody's worried about that because it always happens in private. So, since the whole Sota issue of safek, is she impure, is she not impure, comes up only in a public domain, private domain, so we're only going to be machmir on safek tumah in a private domain. And that's learned out from the Sota. So, how could you say Yossi ben Yoezer is the one who said this? To which they say, Rabbi Yochanan, halacha ve'em, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan explained, halacha ve'em morin. This was a halacha, but we don't teach it. In other words, yes, they learned it out from the Sota, but nobody was willing to go by it. They said, it should still be strict. And then he taught, no, you don't have to be strict about this. You can go by the real base halacha. You don't have to be strict at all. Tanya Namihachi, here's a brighta to support this reading. The whole thing was about this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, korot na'atz lahem. He put in beams to make it very clear what was Rishut Yachid and what was Rishut Rabin. He delineated the whole thing. Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer, Ba'amar, Ad kam Rishut Rabim, Ad kam Rishut Yachid. He delineated all the boundaries so that people knew if you go in this area, you don't have to worry about Tumah. If you walk through, okay, and that's how we know this was the issue of what he matired. Ki atu l'kamei de Rabbi Yanai, amar lehu, when they got in front of Rabbi Yanai, he said, Hi Maya b'shikata de benara zilu tfulu. Now, when the people came before Rabbi Yanai, and they weren't sure if they were tamei or not, he said to them, just go in the water of the Nahar and go dunk. Okay? In other words, he said to them, listen, yes, I understand. Yossi ben Yoezer said, Safek Tuma, you don't have to worry about, but you know what? It's easy enough to just tovel, just do it. Some people learn from here that what he meant to say was, if you can do it, great. If, for example, we're not talking about a person, we're talking about a vessel that you touched, and the only way to deal with the vessel is to break it, because let's say a kli cheres can't be purified, then we're not going to be strict. But we are going to be strict when you could just go in the mikveh anyway. This is a fascinating discussion about heter, about kulas, and can you rely on kulas? Are you better off doing chumras? And we see two different positions here, and it's a very interesting sugya because, right, you see this concern of the rabbis to be called the matir ones, the more liberal, the ones who allow things. Okay. On the other hand, you see they wanted to allow things, especially if the people weren't keeping them, or especially if it was causing unnecessary, difficulties. And that's the base halacha. Why be strict? And then you have the other approach of, certainly what we end with about, well, it's not a big deal to just go in the mikveh anyway, so just do it. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting things about this sugya. Now we're going to end with the beginning of the sugya of bishul akum. Vashlakot, cooked items of Gentiles were forbidden. Minane milit, where do we get it from? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Ka, comes from this pasuk. Ocha b'kesef tishbereini v'achalti, umayim b'kesef titeni v'shatiti. This is when they want to go through the in the Torah, through the property of Sicha Melech HaEmori, right, or the Amorite king, and they say, right, we want, we'll pay for money, we'll give you money for food, okay, and we want to, give us food and water. So now they say, Ma mayim, we're going to learn what can we eat. So here you see they ate from Gentiles. Well, what can we eat? Ma mayim shelo nishtanu, af ochel shelo nishtanu. They're going to say the food was like the water. It can only be food that doesn't change. Water, you can cook it up, right? Nothing will happen to it, or you can do anything you want with it. It's still water, okay? And then they say, okay, well, according to that, then chitim basan klayot hachinami dasira. Now they assume it's not. If I take grains and I toast them, but that's going to be forbidden because I change them, right? So now they say, and if you think, yeah, it's a problem because I changed them, it says they're actually forbidden. So they have to modify this drasha. It's not, it didn't change at all. It didn't change from its original form. Okay, now grains that are toasted are still in the same form of grains. That's why they're allowed. It has to not change its form. Okay. Right? We wouldn't be allowed to buy flour in the store if it wasn't made by a Jew, right? You take the grains, you crush them up, they've changed their form. What? Those aren't allowed? And if you want to say they aren't, right? If you take them and you toast them and you turn them into flour, it's totally fine. Ela mayim kimayim. So let's modify the drasha one last time. Ma mayim shelo nishtanu mibriatam al yidei ha'ol, af ocha shelo nishtanu mibriato al yidei ha'ol. Can't be something that changes when you boil it. Water, you boil it, and nothing happens to it. So likewise, food that you cook that doesn't change when it cooks, by cooking, okay, that's why it could change by grinding. Just can't change its form by cooking. That would be the case. Okay, that's what's going to be forbidden, to which the Gemara asks, Midi or Ktiv, does it say fire anywhere in the Pasuk? Well, Elamida Rabbana Mikras Machtaba'ama. Well, they say in the end, this isn't a Torah law. This is all rabbinic, and they just connected it to that Pasuk, and that's how they used it as a mnemonic to remember exactly what kind of Bishul Akum is going to be forbidden. Okay, I just want to end with this interesting Machloket Rashi Tosfot, or possibly Machloket. Rashi says, why Mida Rabbana did they forbid food? And they say, Yisrael Vagilet Lo B'Machalu Mishtabi Yechelenu Davar Tamei. Rashi says the problem with Bishul Akum, we're worried they're going to feed you non-kosher food. Okay? Tosfot points out that Rashi on the Mishnah, if you turn back to the Mishnah, when it came to Shlakot in the Mishnah, Rashi says, Kol davar shebishlo ovei kochavim, we're on Lamed Hamad Bet, everything that a non-Gentile cooked, afilu b'kli tahor, v'kula mishum chatanut. It's because of intermarriage. So Rashi himself contradicts himself in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is fascinating. But in one place he says it's chatanut, in the other place he says it's where they're going to, if they cook your food, they're going to cook non-kosher stuff, which has huge ramifications, right? So Tosfot says, and quotes Rashi and mentions how Rashi says something else elsewhere, and then says that Omer Harav Rabbeinu Ephraim Rabbi David Divadai Shlakot Asru Kisha Kochavim Mevashlim Bebeito Aval Kshuma Bashel Bebeito Shel Yisrael Ein Lachush Lo Lachatanut V'Lo L'Shamayach L'Dvarim Tmeim. So this Rav Avram Rabbi David wanted to say that either which way you go on these reasons, neither is applicable in the house of the Jew. I assume what they mean in the house of the Jew is because someone's working in your house. There's no concern of intermarriage, and there's no concern of non-kosher because they're cooking in your own house and teach them the rules, and also you only bring kosher food in the house. But lo hodela Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam didn't allow this. Tivadai kevan shovei kochavim mevashel lo chaku klal chachamim be'Rosh Yisrael. Right? They didn't make a distinction this way, that way, because what would happen, right? If kilolam yesh lachush shema lo yishar gam bebeito shel Yisrael kemo bebeito shel ovei kochavim. In other words, we're worried if we allow it in your house, you'll end up doing it in the Gentile's house, and he'll end up leading to all those problems. And therefore, either which way you look at it, it's a problem according to Rabbeinu Tam. But this other rabbi wanted to matir. Obviously, this has very important ramifications. If you have someone working in your house and they're cooking in your house, or all sorts of situations where there's no concern for either non-kosher food or chatanut, would this still be applicable? And that's the concepts anyway. I'm not getting into halacha l'maaseh here. So with that, we finished our daf. Let's just do a quick review. We started with this issue of the zava and the age for the male and the female. Then we got to, right, even though the age isn't so relevant, they still go by the typical age. It's interesting. We end kind of at the same way we started, with this idea that sometimes things aren't necessarily relevant, but we kind of still keep the same rules to make things more clear cut, and that there isn't lack of, misinterpretation in anywhere. Then we got to this whole thing about Rabbi Simlai said to Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, look, you matir shemen, why don't you matir the bread of the Gentiles? And then he said, I don't want to become off as a matir Beit Din, as the one who's very lenient. And then he gave some examples of Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer, right? But Rabbi Simla said he did 3, you did only 1, so 2 would be okay. But then he said, no, there's another one. Then the Gemara tried to figure out which one that is. And they bring this example of the get, even though it was a different rabbi who thought that wasn't Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya who said that. And then we had the whole thing about the get and what is the debate there really between the two, between the Mishnah and this takana that Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya supposedly instituted. Then we got to Tokadei. We then went back to the 3 things that Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer permitted and why he permitted them and what was his debate with the rabbis. And that was kind of complicated to figure out what were all these cases. Some of them, there were debates about what the cases were. The last one, it just took a while till we figured out exactly what the case was. We said in the end it was Safek Tumah B'Reshut Rabim. So we got into that whole issue. And then we ended with the Shlakot and the Bishul Akum and what the issues are, and where they get the source, which in the end wasn't really the source, but it was somewhere where the rabbis connected a pasuk to remembering what exactly about Bishul Akum is permitted. And we'll continue that sugya in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.